to the Guardian columnist Jonathan Freedland, who also takes the long view on BBC Radio 4. He joins us via webcam from central London. Jonathan, thanks very much for being with us. You spent 4 years as a newspaper correspondent in the United States. You reported on previous mass shootings. I wonder what your thoughts are on this one this weekend.
Well, like everyone, really, very dispirited, very glum. The notion of a mass shooting anywhere is always horrific. There is something that feels like an extra violation about it being in a place that the people who were killed and wounded would have seen as a sanctuary. They were there to engage in prayer. They were there to celebrate a birth, a new arrival to that community. And as you heard from Gary O'Donoghue, old people, the oldest, that 97-year-old, was a survivor of the Holocaust who thought she had come to a place in America that was a haven and that was safe from anti-Semitism, and yet there was somebody who came in armed to the teeth saying all Jews must die, as Jews were scattered and, from initial reports, hiding in basements and in attics. I mean, that has a horrible historical echo, and so Jewish communities in America, around the world, in this country, are feeling tremendous pain and sorrow and probably fear after this.
We were talking to a rabbi from a different synagogue in Pittsburgh an hour ago who was acknowledging that, in recent years security has been tightened up almost routinely in synagogues, even where there's been no specific threat, because of a kind of a darkening of the atmosphere and mood. What do you kind of attribute that to, if it is possible to attribute it to it? Is it simply that there's more availability now for people who have always had these views, who have maybe expressed them within the home or would express them when they're drinking with friends or whatever, but now possibly with workmates, but they haven't had the opportunity that, for example, social media now provides?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of why there's security, and people have asked this question, if you go to any Jewish building in this country, there is security.
Indeed, yeah.
Schools and synagogues, and that's because those buildings are under threat. They are targeted, and it's happened in Europe, in Copenhagen or in Toulouse, in Paris, where there are supermarkets and schools and synagogues, and Jewish museum in Brussels, and now we have to add Pittsburgh to that list. So the threat is rational, or rather the fear is rational because the threat is real. But on your point, I think the social media and the media generally has acted as a huge amplifier for far-right, anti-Semitic and far-right white supremacist rhetoric has always been around, exactly as you say, but whereas once it might have been confined to, poorly printed newsletters being handed under the counter in dodgy bookshops or pubs, now it's available at the click of a mouse. You can read this stuff. It's just on your phone if you want to read it. But I do think there is a particular element in the United States at the moment, which is that this sort of hateful rhetoric does get an endorsement, an echo, an amplifier from the very top, which is you have a president in Donald Trump who echoes the themes, the tropes of white supremacism and particularly anti-Jewish racism. He makes a bogeyman of George Soros, who is a hate figure for the anti-Semitic right. He talks about globalists, which is a code word used on the right about Jews, and therefore it gets a kind of imprimatur, a kind of legitimacy when the president himself uses that language.
We see in this country people struggling with how to deal with issues of that kind on the left as well as on the right. President Trump and his supporters, of course, say, look, we haven't been directly anti-Semitic about anybody. We're very supportive of the state of Israel. How can these accusations be laid at the president's door?
Yeah, they might say that, and so unfortunately, the support for Israel point is distinct, because there are people who can be supportive of the state of Israel partly for reasons I wouldn't applaud, because they see it as somehow a bulwark against Muslims, and so they think they like Israel, and nevertheless are very hostile to Jews, and so you can see that in all kinds of places, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. So that doesn't get anybody off the hook. That's no kind of alibi. The important point with Trump is the idea is his closing advertisement, for example, in 2016, was an ad that featured, and none of these things happen by accident, a series of George Soros was one, Janet Yellen, then the head of the Federal Reserve, was another, Jewish figures, Jewish individuals, while the voiceover did again talk about globalism, and international capital. These are the old tunes that have been hammered out by the anti-Jewish racist right for decades, if not centuries, and he knows what he's doing. He even used the word, Trump even used the word globalist last night. Now, to you or me, we may think that's a word about globalization in an argument about globalization versus nationalism. To anti-Semites, they know what that signal means. It's a dog whistle which all of them hear and understand, and he channels it and he mainstreams it by using it. And Soros, who is held up as this sort of, he's a billionaire philanthropist, himself actually a survivor of the Holocaust, who is used as a sort of poster, as a face for accusations of conspiracy, as if he's some kind of sinister puppet master. Anti-Semites know what that means. It's a code they use among each other, and they understand it when it comes from the president. So I'm not impressed by a few of the gestures he's made, whether they're about Israel or even the lip service speeches he reads when they're put in front of him. I notice instead what he says. And one of the things about what he said yesterday was very telling, not when he was scripted, when he was reacting. His first reaction actually was to blame this Jewish community itself, saying they should have had armed guards, but they chose not to, as if it's, between the lines, it's kind of their fault, and that the only people he had any warm words for were the police. He couldn't find it in himself to express empathy, sympathy, distress at the pain and anguish of fellow American citizens. He just said they should have had armed guards there.
The other aspect, and essentially you touch on this as well, is the question of mass shootings, the thing that we're not really used to in this country and that people have become depressingly used to in the States, including in your time there, is seeing the human scale of these actions, the kind of ricochet effect, because the sheer numbers and all those people with friends and families who are in mourning today because of this terrible end to their lives, shocking end to those lives, and those injured as well. And
That's
yet
right.
that doesn't seem to, and that doesn't seem, there still doesn't seem to be a connection made for many in public life in the United States with the relative ease with which it is possible to acquire not just one weapon, but many weapons.
Yes, I mean, you've mentioned my time as a correspondent in the United States, and like a lot of Brits who serve in that role, or anybody from abroad, that was almost the biggest gulf in understanding between me and them, between any outsider to that society and America, is this obsession with fetish even of not just guns, because in a way you could get your head around the idea of handguns or or sporting weapons. This man went in there armed with military grade weapons, an AR-15, an assault rifle, capable of killing people very rapidly in huge numbers. And so yes, there have been attacks on deranged people attacking schools in other countries in the world, and indeed attacks, as I mentioned before, on Jewish targets. But so in those cases, the casualties are usually in the low single figures. The difference in America is somebody who is motivated by hate, wherever that motivation has come from, is able to kill people in the double digits, and as we saw in Las Vegas, in the high double digits. And that's simply because of the ease of access to these deadly military-grade weapons. When I was in the United States in the mid-90s, President then, Bill Clinton, had passed an assault weapons ban, and that did reduce the scale of some of these shootings. But then Republicans took over the Congress, and they overturned that ban and made it more easy for people, even people with histories of mental illness, people who publicly had posted online messages of hate, of racism, of white supremacism. They can walk in and buy these military weapons easily. And that, to me, is a huge disconnect between us from the outside and people in America. And I don't know how you ever bridge that divide, but at some point you would think they would see this as a huge part of a national malaise, a national malady, rather, that they are confronting.
Jonathan Freedland from The Guardian, thanks very much.
Thank you.